So the good news, in my opinion, is that the defense of pre-existing condition restrictions, which is, you know, a technical metaphor for access to affordable health care for all, that became a winning issue for all the D House candidates, and it was so much of a winning issue that the vulnerable R's felt compelled to lie about their own position on the matter, which is proof you got them when they start mirroring your talking points and claiming they're theirs. And so the other good news is Medicaid expansion passed on the ballot in Idaho. Let me say it one more time. Idaho, Utah, Nebraska. And that's proof, in my view, that some very red state voters actually want their low-income fellow citizens to have access to affordable care too. Again, the correct inference is that the majority of Americans want all of us to have health care, and the existential threat at the end of this to the ACA is now deflected, not defeated, it is deflected for 2 years. The D's, of course, have apparently won now 40 House seats. They have a majority. They outpolled Republicans in total across the country by 9 million votes, which is the largest margin since Watergate. Some of you are too young to remember that, but it was this F-up in the 70s. And so that's pretty good news. It's a good indication of the way the country sentiment is moving. And D's may have restored some of the pieces of that broken blue wall that crashed down in November of 16. They won the governorships in Michigan, Wisconsin, wasn't that a sweet one, and Pennsylvania, and picked up House seats in all those states. They picked up governorships and state House seats, which will help in the gerrymandering wars after the 2020 census, and of course in Medicaid implementation. And my personal favorite little nugget of good news, Newt Gingrich's old seat is now held by Lucy McBath. You may know, the African-American gun safety advocate. For her teenage son was killed by a crazy racist at a gas station for playing music a few years ago. Now, there is bad news. The bad news is the D's lost 2 seats in the Senate on net, and they lost some close statewide elections despite unprecedented grassroots organizing and a lot of outside money. A fair bit of it came from our House. And so Florida, Texas, Georgia, we lost, even though it was obviously stolen in Georgia, but nevertheless we lost. The Mississippi Senate race is a reminder that Trump's base remains committed to him and his divisive policies. I think even though we outnumber them, we're all shocked at how large a core he actually has. And this is important. The exit polls suggest that Trump's approval remains strong among non-college educated white men and women in the Sun Belt. He lost some points in the Midwest in that group, but he did not lose in the Sun Belt. So this notion that we're going to go take Arizona now is perhaps a little optimistic. And that's kind of the last bad news I'll say. Taking the Senate in 2020 is going to be much harder than the math would imply, right? We had a whole bunch up this time, they got a whole bunch up next time, but a lot of those they have up are not really contestable because of rural domination. So it's going to be tougher to take the Senate than it should be. So what are the uncertainties that come out of this good news and bad news? Well, the biggest one, and maybe the only one that really matters, is I'm not sure anybody really knows what the smartest electoral strategy is for the D's going forward. You could go all in progressive, have a completely uncompromising agenda, and focus on turning out the D base. You could certainly do the math and say that could win. But you could also modulate and appeal to disaffected independents who clearly don't like Trump. I mean, what's astounding is to look at the voting in the suburbs of Dallas and how similar the voting in the suburbs of Dallas are to the suburbs of Washington, D.C. They're now closer to Arlington than they are to the people who are deep red not too far from them. But they don't like Trump, but they fear aggressively redistributive politics. So even a strategy focusing on restoring the blue wall and not the Sun Belt will probably require appealing to the white working class up there. And then the question is how best to do that. Do you compromise with Trump maybe on infrastructure, maybe even on border something? Pass bills in the House that the R's won't touch and lay down a gauntlet and say this is what we would do and we don't need their votes ever. Those are really big choices, and they're choices that are going to have to be made. So, what about the healthcare values discussion? Well, I think it's fair to say, and it's not obviously very difficult to predict, what the Ds are going to do in the House is establish what they would do if they had the Senate and the White House. It's all going to be about messaging bills, and because we can't get anything past the Senate, really. The Senate Ds will also try to do this, and they'll certainly go on TV a lot, but they don't have the same megaphone the House will, because the House will control the hearing agendas. And not much real progress is possible, of course, until 2021. So you can expect a lot of compare and contrast of D approaches to R approaches. And that's partly why values will be such an important part of this messaging. Since legislation is not possible or likely, policy details matter less than broad themes. Remember what I think Maya Angelou said: people don't really remember what you said, people remember how you made them feel. And so I would suggest we and our allies need to make folks feel like we care about them. We need to make folks feel like we're trying to restore for all the America we thought we had before the Trump interregnum. That is, an America that believes in liberty and justice for all, not just for rich white men. All men are created equal, wrote Thomas Jefferson. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, said Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg. And notice he did not say of, by, and for some of the people. Liberty and justice for all, says the Pledge of Allegiance. FDR asserted that all people, worldwide actually, share in the right to 4 fundamental freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. The First Amendment to our Constitution says a lot of this, along with freedom of the press. And if you think about it, the contrast of these values, these time-honored American values, to Trump's zero-sum, threatened white supremacist worldview, and the worldview elected Republicans have come to accept and defend, that contrast could not be more stark. So Ds will try to contrast the divergence between these shared American values and the manifest priorities of the Trump supporters: tax and regulation cuts for the rich, right-wing judges for the right-wing evangelicals, and you throw culture war scraps to the rabid base when you need to pump them up. Emphasis, interestingly, in my opinion, will likely end up being less on Trump as time passes, although Mueller will do his duty, but more on those who elected and enabled him, because that's who we've got to beat to take the Senate back, who oppose the D agenda of health care for all, freedom from want, freedom from fear, opportunity for all to thrive and to prosper. Now, in a way, climate change, human rights, freedom of the press versus, say, condoning the Khashoggi murder could all be linked with a fiscally prudent call to raise taxes on the rich, to reduce the burden on future generations of current spending, to make the future actually possible by voting Democratic. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow, but do find a different song for 2020. There will be hearings exposing Trumpian malfeasance and the emolument business, and it will be part of the long game contrasting strategy. The most important thing, though, is discrediting Trump as a troubadour of the white working class. That's got to be job one. Also, I would offer up humbly that we need to learn to be less condescending toward those who have not yet reached our stage of enlightenment, because that's also got to be part of the strategy. What's really true is that mostly his people hate us more than they love anybody else, and they hate us because they think we look down at them. Sometimes they're not wrong. Okay, Medicare for all, single payer, Medicare buy-in, Medicare as is for all, Medicare Advantage for all that stuff will very likely be central to this, because it's a very simple issue to contrast. This will be an easy win, in my view, if we avoid being too specific or prescriptive. Here's the good news. The R's have squandered all their credibility on health care. They don't want to talk about health care ever again, okay? And therefore, it's abundantly clear, and those votes in Idaho prove it. Most of us agree all Americans should have health care, and most of us agree the government has to help make that happen. There's no way to make it happen any other way. How that happens, however, in my view, is for those who get elected in 2020 to work out. We shouldn't legislate it in the campaign. The point in 2019 and during the campaign of 2020 is to make clear who is for all having access to affordable care and who is only for some. This should not be a hard lift. Dees will also hold hearings on how the Trump regulatory stuff and all the little things they're doing with the subsidies and limited duration and yada, 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 just to prove they're for some and not all. There will be some attempt, and God bless Patty Murray for trying. I don't think the R's in the Senate are likely to cooperate on an ACA fix, but it's important to make them vote no. Medicare drug negotiation actually has way more legs than you might think, but again, I can't imagine that being supported in the Senate. In case you hadn't noticed, Pharma owns the Republican Party. They own a chunk of the Democratic Party too, in case you're wondering. So that ain't happening until 2021. But it could pass the House and it could force a vote. I would expect some hearings on Medicaid work requirements in the House and some stuff on how non-expansion versus expansion states have fared to drive the point home what ACA repeal would do. Now, work requirements are tricky, I will say, because they do sound reasonable at the 50,000-foot level to moderates and independents. But that's why exposing exactly how they've been implemented in Arkansas in particular is so important, because that'll drive home the point of how unreasonably mean-spirited and how the approvals by CMS were quite cynical. But I will say, as an economist, for what it's worth, there probably is a work requirement regime that we would consider reasonable. It hasn't been devised or implemented yet, but it is going to be a discussion we probably shouldn't shut down completely. The opioid crisis, in case you hadn't noticed, is real, and there is fairly clear evidence that medication-assisted treatment works, but a very small fraction of the people who survive their opioid endeavors actually get that treatment. It's not clear Congress can do much about this, but Medicaid expansion clearly can. Now, here's some more good news, the social determinants of health. How many of you know what that is? This, you know, all the stuff upstream today, I figured this crap. Social determinants of health have been discovered by the healthcare system. And some of people have known about them for quite some time, but it's news to hospitals, and they learned about it through readmission penalties, God bless them, because they figured out they're going to have to pay money back to Medicare if they don't solve this problem, and they also figured out you can't solve this problem inside their walls. You got to go upstream. Who knew, right? Who knew? And so there's a lot of activity on that front. The second thing that drove home social determinants is the opioid crisis. You can't fix this unless you actually get the person out of the park, into the emergency room, into treatment, get their kids taken care of, get them a job, wrap them in a community that protects them from the people who took them to the drugs in the first place. It's a social determinant of health diagram. And even Azar, God bless him, proposed last week a new CMMI initiative on social determinants. I can't wait to read the details of that. But seriously, discussion of social determinants of health, especially bipartisan discussion of social determinants of health, centers the conversation in healthcare on community, where our values, emphasizing all and not some, are the most powerful. I'm not sure exactly why, but progressives have always seen the connections among the structural conditions, behavior, and outcomes. Ours never saw it until now. And it took a little, frankly, racial solidarity in the opioid crisis. Oh my God, these are my people, so therefore it must be a disease, not a moral failing. Okay, well, but you know what? Welcome to the tent, because they have figured out it's a disease, and they've also figured out it's more than opioids. This is progress. So, you know, the scales have fallen from their eyes, so now's the time to close the deal and cement their connection to affordable health care and justice for all, because they figured out you can't actually have it for some unless all have it. So focusing on social determinants of health in communities will help us keep the mind's eye local. And here's what I've learned. I don't know why, but you know, I get to talk about this stuff all over the country. It's a mystery to myself and my wife, but people like the accent, I guess. But I'll just say every place I've ever been, every human I talk to wants it to work where they live. They want their community to work. They want it to work. They want every child in their neighborhood to have a good chance. They want the 4 freedoms for everybody they know. Our fundamental task is to broaden the definition of neighborhood and broaden the definition of neighbors to extend to people who don't live near us and don't look so much like us. The easiest way to do this, in my view, is reminding everyone that America was always multiracial. Good Lord, we were the original immigrants, after all. America was founded to provide freedom of religion. It was always committed to equality before the law, which eventually led us to admit that included women and descendants of slaves and now the LGBTQ community. We need to remind people that America was once a beacon to the world precisely because we welcomed immigrants who made us stronger and smarter and more creative and who we are in every historical sense of those words. Our America welcomes all, demands respect for all, protects all, and expects all of us to help bind together the fabric of our nation into an unbreakable thread of values that unite us forever. Thank you very much.